Good afternoon. My name is Tim Shriver. I am so pleased and proud to welcome all of you to this very important briefing with extraordinarily well-informed, expert, and insightful guests at an extraordinary moment in time. It's my honor on behalf of CASEL and the Committee for Children. I represent CASEL as its board chair and one of its co-founders, and have long collaborated with Committee for Children, initially as one of its teachers and now as one of its fans, as we attempt over these many, many years, and in fact decades, our work together to promote a new vision, a new paradigm, a new message about the power, the importance, the urgency of education. Let me just say that my time ends in 1 minute, since we started a few minutes late, so you don't worry, you won't get a long speech. I just want to make a few summary comments capturing a little bit the history of CASEL's work, as well as the more recent work from the National Commission on Social and Emotional and Academic Development, recently convened by the Aspen Institute and issuing its final report just a few weeks ago. In many ways, this final report represents the culmination of several decades of research, several decades of innovation in practice, several decades of thought and review on public policy, and it represents, as it says in the introduction, a remarkable consensus. And this consensus you will hear about more today, but let me just give you the headline. For a generation, we have thought that educators are deeply divided from their reformer cousins. This report says, contrary to popular opinion, they are not divided. For a generation, we have thought that business and education don't speak the same language. This report says they are speaking exactly the same language. For a generation, we have thought that schools and classrooms did not have the same responsibility as pupil personnel or community-based organizations. This report says they have very similar, in fact, strongly nested responsibilities. For a generation, we have thought that mental health was the province of people in clinical settings and education was completely divorced from it. This report says that's exactly wrong, that they have very similar common ground. Maybe most importantly, here in the Capitol, for a generation, we have thought that Republicans and Democrats don't agree about schools. This report says, without any exception, that Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and progressives, label whoever you want. There is a deep and powerful consensus that Republicans and Democrats can join together in assuring that when we focus on how children learn, when we focus on the art and science of teaching and learning, we have agreement. That children learn through a social filter, that the way in which children learn is not only a process which we need to focus on, but a product we need to create, that as we continue our long conversation in education about what kind of country we want to become, that the moment has come for us to focus on integrating the child, the social, the emotional, the cognitive development, to end the barriers that lead so often to the underperformance of children and begin to open the doors of learning to all. So if I had just one saying, it would be that the era of either or is over. It is not a question of whether we teach the heart or the head. It is not a question of whether families or teachers. It is not a question of academics versus relationships. All of those dichotomies are over. And there is a consensus. This is not some political vantage point, not some new avatar of ideas coming from some academic institution. This is a broad consensus from neuroscience right up to Capitol Hill. We have a new era. It is the era of both and you are here today to hear, and I hope help us act on the most powerful lever of change we have, which is the possibility of once and for all shifting the training of teachers from simply being the training of people in the distribution of content and information to the training of teachers as experts in child development. We believe, and the report reinforces, that the most powerful change we can make in education would be to equip teachers to become experts in child development. After all, we believe education is fundamentally the practice of development. It is time we brought the field of development into the field of education, equipping our teachers not just to know science or history or mathematics or social studies, foreign languages or great literature, but also to know children and to know that those two bodies of work with equal expertise. So it is my first pleasure, and I'll just say at the outset that one of the great champions of this work, Congressman Tim Ryan, may be stopping by, and if he does, we will do what everyone knows how to do here on Capitol Hill, which is stop the presses and give the member a chance to share his perspective with us. He has been simply indispensable in this work. But until he comes, we have other people who are indispensable in this work, Dr. Mylien Duong and Dr. Kimberly Schonert-Reichl, two experts on the research, the status of the research on teacher training, where it lies today and where it can go. So without further ado, I give it over to you two. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Tim. Is this working? Good? Good to go. Great. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here today and be able to share with you some of the research that really makes the case for embedding and integrating social and emotional learning within teacher preparation. But before I get into those sort of nuts and bolts of ways to do that, I'm going to just, again, make the emphasis of the time has come for social and emotional learning to be integrated into our education system. The data really show three things I'm going to highlight. One is social and emotional skills actually predict important adult outcomes. Research is really showing that those students with strong social and emotional skills from even elementary school are more likely to graduate from high school, earn a college degree, and find stable employment. Those students with lower social emotional skills are more likely to have problems in the criminal justice system, be on subsidized housing, and take a number of other factors. The other thing, and Tim made a remark about this, is that the neuroscience, and really what is brand new about this research is that we know much more about how the brain works and the neuroplasticity. So even a decade ago, we did not know the way that learning is integrated with emotions. So how you feel affects how and what you learn. And it's really, research in neuroscience has really shown us that you can promote these skills. You can teach skills such as getting along with others, conflict resolution skills. And so that malleability piece is really critical. And the third one is that these skills are durable, which means that even if you get them in longitudinal research showing that if you are taught these skills in elementary school, if you receive social and emotional learning, one longitudinal study found that you're more likely to be employed, to have higher economic assets, but also you're more likely to vote and to volunteer in your community. So again, thinking about these, again, it's no longer a question, do we do it or not? The data are very clear. So the question remains though, do teachers, when you're learning to become a teacher, get anything about social and emotional learning? How to promote students' social and emotional competence? What we know from data about teachers entering the profession, that some of the data now shows us that about 50% of teachers leave within the first 5 years of teaching, costing us $7 billion because of leaving. And when you ask teachers, why are you leaving the profession? They say things like classroom management, problems, dealing with the stress, all of those factors, especially the attrition rate is much higher in those high urban centers. And when you ask them, what do they wish they would have learned? They say, I wish I would have, in my teacher preparation program, had more coursework on how to deal with the whole child, the social and emotional aspects of teaching and learning. So to address this, a couple of years ago, CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, commissioned a scan, which I conducted with a team, to look at the degree to which social and emotional learning was integrated within colleges of education. Actually, there were two pieces. We first looked at policy and looked at every single state to see, was there any policy in teacher certification that said you had to have these something to do with SEL. And we found some states had some did not. And then the second part of the scan, we looked at 3 dimensions of social and emotional learning. We looked at the learning context or school climate. Did Did teacher candidates learn anything about that? We also then looked at their own social and emotional competence, another factor that really is growing in terms of its importance, and then teaching social and emotional learning to students. And would you believe that we found only 2 states that had colleges of education in the United States that had anything to do with teaching SEL to students in their colleges of education? You're wondering what the states were? I knew you would ask that. Utah and the District of Columbia were the only 2 places which had a teacher education program that had coursework that addressed these issues. Now, to me, the answer is pretty simple. You know, if on the one hand you have teachers leaving in droves in the profession, the teacher attrition, which is huge, and we have an increasing teacher shortage, which a lot is due to teachers leaving the profession once they've actually been trained. You have, on the other hand, knowing that teachers who receive training in social emotional learning are more likely able to not only teach those skills to their students, but they themselves benefit from teaching social emotional learning program. The research actually shows that they increase in their own teaching efficacy and their own well-being. And the other factor that, again, is really important is the idea that you can do this. And so right now, there are a number of colleges of education across the U.S. that are already doing this, that have coursework or have programs that are integrating social emotional learning. But it's really more the exception than the rule. So we already have exemplars to see how to do it in a number of different ways, but we now can move forward with really looking at those exemplars and figure out how to do it. Thanks. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, my name is Mylien Duong, and I am a senior research scientist at the Committee for Children. I'm also an affiliate assistant professor at University of Washington. And I think the reason that I was asked here today was because I'm the scientist that is working on the team to develop a social emotional learning program for educators at the Committee for Children. And those of you that know the Committee for Children know that we've been around for about 40 years, and our focus has traditionally been on kids. Our mission is to have safe children thriving in a peaceful world. And what we're really after is social, emotional, and health outcomes of children. That's what we spent the last 40 years doing. And we kept repeatedly, as we were in the field, hearing from teachers, hearing from building and from school and district leaders, well, what about the adults? And, you know, as we ask teachers to implement our program, they say, how do you expect me to teach this when I didn't grow up with this? I didn't get this in school, and I'm learning this along with my kids. And what they really want is better preparation in order to meet that challenge. They understand the need for this. The McGraw-Hill survey that I think was just completed in 2018 showed that something like 90% of educators believe that social emotional learning is just as important as academic learning. And in that same survey, 22% of teachers said that they felt very prepared to teach SEL to their kids. So you can see that there's a huge gap there in terms of how important they think it is and how prepared they feel to implement it in their classroom. And I think, you know, any of us that attended school, that's been in a classroom, know that great teaching is not about just delivering instruction. Right? Teachers don't just instruct, they also motivate. They create a safe and positive environment where children can learn. They coach students to cooperate with one another. They mediate conflict. And most of all, they're role models for respectful behavior. And like Kim is saying, what they have is an incredibly stressful job. And one thing, and I did some teaching myself for about 6 weeks. As part of testing a curriculum, and it was honestly the longest 6 weeks of my life. And the thing I think people don't understand is that teachers are required to be in that classroom every minute that the class is in session. So if you get upset, you know, you're worried about your sick kid, or, you know, some kid is really ticking you off, you don't get to excuse yourself and go. No, you are there, and you're supposed to be the model of emotional control. And that, to me, is a very tall order, to be with it and emotionally in control for 8 hours a day in front of 25 to 30 kids. And I have so much respect for teachers because many of them rise to this challenge. And at the same time, I don't feel that we've done a good job of preparing them to meet this challenge. And I think that there is actually, like Tim was saying, huge, broad public support for social emotional learning. That we realize that that education is not just about academic performance, it's about civic engagement, it's about values, it's about work habits, and it's about preparing our youth in order to become contributing members of the US society and of the workforce. And we have not set up our teacher preparation in order to attend to those aspects of education. I think the good news, I know it's all sound pretty bleak right now, but the good news is that there are actually programs that do this really well. They're just not implemented at scale and they're not widely available. So for example, there are programs that have shown that when you train teachers in stress management, in mindfulness, in relationship skills, that not only do you reduce their stress and burnout, but that you see the impact of that in their classroom so that they have more positive and more productive classes. And we've seen programs that have tried to, that have attuned teachers to empathy for their students and found that those programs reduced referral rates, suspension rates, by about 50% school-wide. So the science is there. We know how to do this. Now what we just need is to make these effective programs and these effective trainings available at scale and available to teachers earlier in their training. I think that's.
I get to ask the first question. Let's start questions. So questions, comments for this first tranche? So I guess the question I want to ask either or both of you is maybe a little bit of an historic one. So there have been major shifts. We've studied and seen that, for instance, in the early part of the 20th century, the training of doctors was changed dramatically by a series of reports and a series of innovations in science that led to the migration of an empirical dimension of medicine into the training of doctors, which in turn led to a significant change in the way medicine was structured around the world. Is there a possibility? Could we see a sort of a seismic shift? Is there a paradigm shift possible of that order of magnitude where people will look back on the early part of the 21st century and say that's when teacher training took a major turn in a direction that was seismic?
Well, I'm going to answer. One thing is because I am in a faculty of education, I've been a teacher educator for a couple of decades. And actually, I was a teacher as well. I went through a teacher education program in Illinois State University, and taught around Chicago. And I would say, on the one hand, I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to say, yes, of course. I actually think there's some dissatisfaction with current teacher education programs because they don't, a lot of students who go through them don't feel that they are applying it as much. They don't have the practical experience. And so you see a lot more programs that are trying to be embedded within the communities, within the school system. So I would say, yes, that is happening. And I think that a lot of the world is changing. We need different types of skills and teaching. And so I think that there's going to be a real paradigm shift. And I've seen it in some places already that are really being innovative and really redoing their teacher preparation programs to include much more innovative approaches to have constant practicums working in different schools. I think Wendy will talk a bit about one of those.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add to that? I think that within the last decade, we've seen a seismic shift in the way that we think about students, right? Back in the 70s, 80s, we used to think about them as blank slates that you kind of deposit knowledge into your students. And now now we say that, and that just sounds so incredibly foreign because we really have focused more on the things that happen to kids inside and outside of the classroom, their social, their emotional experiences, their connections to each other, their connections with teachers, and them being part of a community and attending to the whole child. And so if we want our school systems to attend to the whole child, we've got to set up our school systems to attend to the whole child. And I think a key part of that is going to be teacher preparation.
Have either of you seen, sorry, I've got so many questions. I could carry on this conversation the whole time. So other questions, conversation. This is, as you can see, I hope, a conversation opportunity. So those of you, particularly who live and work in this building, please feel free to interrupt at any time because we want to make sure your questions get, yes, all the way in the back. Yes. And maybe you could just introduce yourself if you don't mind, yeah.
Hi, my name is Yesenia Ayala, and I'm currently a fellow with the HELP Committee with Senator Murray. So my question is, can emotional and social learning go before cultural competency learning, or do they go hand in hand? What's the dynamic between the two? Because we have also seen that students of color and underrepresented students have been affected in terms of like disciplinary actions taken by schools and educators.
Yeah, I was going to say yes.
Yes. They go hand in hand. And I think, and unfortunately, historically speaking, they have not gone hand in hand. That social emotional learning has really been a field in and of itself, and culturally responsive teaching has been a field in and of itself. But in recent years, and CASEL has led some of the important work on this, people are starting to recognize that you can't do one without the other. And I absolutely agree that when we're talking about the whole child and we're talking about relationships between educators and students, that we need to think about the biases that pervade our society, the systemic disadvantages that pervade our society, and that sets up children differently when they come into the classroom, and it sets up educators differently when they interact with students.
And I want to emphasize one thing. So when we talk about social and emotional learning, a lot of people first think that it's just about preparing teachers to teach students those social emotional learning skills, but really it's about the social emotional competence of the educator as well. So if you look at the 5 dimensions of CASEL, developing self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, when I talk about embedding SEL into teacher preparation, I'm assuming or hoping that the idea is not only preparing teachers to have the skills and the competencies in order to help their students learn those competencies, but they develop those competencies themselves. They develop better. And when in our scan, we actually found there were some places that actually dealt with some of those competencies for adults. Responsible decision-making, because it was like how to report and all of those kinds of things, and social awareness, but there was hardly just a very small number of courses that actually had anything about teachers developing their own self-awareness or their own self-management, how they self-regulate their stress.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to that. So, because the terms are confusing here, sometimes people hear social emotional learning and they'll say, well, I'm interested in that, but I prefer character, or I like character, but I'm actually more focused on equity, or I think equity is the big issue, but cultural competence is actually more important. The language is our enemy here in some ways, and we are trying very hard to defeat those categories of thought that tend to make people feel like they're in separate camps. In my view, at least, the goal here is a paradigm shift. It goes back to a very basic principle that many of us learned, many of us did learn in our early years, which is that teaching and learning is a relationship. And so to be able to be in that relationship, if you're a teacher, you have to be culturally competent if you're going to be effective. And learning to be culturally competent will include learning listening skills, learning dialoguing skills, learning to understand the child's way of expressing him or herself, learning to identify barriers to learning that may be unique to that particular, not just race or culture, but community, school, neighborhood. Learning to be able to identify how to help children overcome stress and trauma or other adverse experiences. So the field we're trying to create here, which we're calling social and emotional learning, is really just a platform around which many of these issues will begin to surface and we'll get better at them, but they're not separate, if you will, from one another. They each have a role, I believe, in the reforms we're describing. I hope that makes some sense. Any other questions? And if not, we'll get ready to shift. to the next panel, if that's okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schonert-Reichl and Dr. Duong. Thank you very much. And I would like to now ask Dr. Scott Brabrand and Ray Lozano and Wendy Burke to come up. We'll shift a little bit our focus from the research perspective to the practice perspective and hear from people active on the front lines. And then we'll have a few minutes at the end for summary questions and integration and some real talk about the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act, where we need Senator Murray very much and others to be on board with some big thinking. But without further delay, I'll ask you guys to the bios are in your folders, so we're not going to take a long time to reintroduce everybody with long bios, but maybe each of you could introduce yourselves and then share your perspective.
Well, I'll just say good afternoon, everybody. I'm Scott Brabrand. I'm superintendent in Fairfax County Public Schools. We're your neighbor next door here outside of the District of Columbia. We have about 190,000 kids. We're the 10th largest school district in the country. And I really feel honored and privileged to get a chance to talk to you about SEL today.
Hi, I'm Wendy Burke. I'm a professor of curriculum instruction in the Department of Teacher Education, also the department head at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And I'm thrilled to also be part of this panel to share a little bit about what we've been doing at Eastern in the context of also understanding the relationship between SEL and teacher preparation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ray Lozano. I am the Executive Director for Student and Family Empowerment in El Paso, Texas. And our department leads the rollout of systemic SEL implementation through 92 schools by 2020. And currently, we're serving 56 schools. We have a partnership with the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning to provide technical assistance as we systemically roll out social emotional learning through our campus. And pleased and honored to have this opportunity to share what's happening in El Paso ISD with respect to SEL.
So first, I just want to say, this is so important. I'm so glad you all are here. You know, I was a government teacher. I was a teacher in Fairfax, then a principal, then a member of the leadership team. I left to go to a smaller district in Virginia, and then I've returned to be part of the Fairfax family again. I grew up during the era of No Child Left Behind, right? The reality is the reason that wasn't successful is we fixated on just the academics. The kids who struggled under No Child Left Behind, who were left behind, are challenged with social, emotional issues that have gone unaddressed in our school districts. So to be honest, SEL is the missing piece. If we had this from the beginning, I don't know that we would have gone through 2 reiterations of No Child Left Behind to now ESSA, Every Student Succeeds. But for every student to succeed, we need that social emotional foundation, both in the kids and in our teachers. We do an induction program. We hire about 2,000 teachers a year. The number one section after we have the big general session, the number one breakout that teachers want in is how to do social emotional supports in schools. So the researchers did an amazing job to say only 2 states, that's not enough. And we do need to see in the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act a demand that every teacher prep program, I'd say by 2020, 2021, has got to have those components in it. If our teachers are coming in asking for it, the research says that they need it, we've got to tell our colleges now, not later. We can't wait. We're in an ER atmosphere, I think, in some school districts. Well, not even districts. It's really some kids are in the ER. And until schools provide the supports in place, they're going to remain in the ER. We've got to have those supports. We are working on something with Yale University called Ruler, which is a program to really first teach adults about social emotional learning and supports. We have about 5 of our 25 high schools, and we're working to get about 60 of our elementary schools up and running for next year. And I'm very excited about that. We've really positioned our work around Portrait of a Graduate, which is really the whole child that Tim talked about, to say to teachers, this isn't one more thing. And again, the research says teachers do want it, but you have to figure out how you integrate this into the entire approach to what we're doing in schools. So we're working in the first year or two with Ruler on teaching the adults what to do and how to do wellness for themselves. I thought your points were right on, Professor. Or you're a scientist, I'm sorry, right, Mylien? And a professor. You're asking adults, kids learn how to push buttons, and they get good at it, right? And you sit there for 7 or 8 hours. I was a teacher. I taught seniors. They were ready to get out of high school and go on to the next experience. They became experts at knowing your mental state and how to use it to their maximum advantage. I mean, there's Hollywood movies about it, right, that people go and watch for fun. We've got to empower our teachers to know how to regulate themselves, and we're doing far more wellness learning that's cropped up. We have teachers who are doing as part of intervention periods in school that used to be academic interventions in elementary school. They're doing wellness strategies. Big hit, but Ruler is being implemented, and we look forward to sharing the results with you. Finally, I would just tell you, sometimes there's a big discussion about safety and security in our schools today. We need to harden our schools on the outside, more cameras, more metal detectors. The truth is, to get our schools more safe and secure, we need to soften them on the inside with social emotional learning and supports. So when we really want to talk about the security of our schools for the future, the path is through SEL. And last year when we did our security review, we didn't ask for more security guards, we didn't ask for more cameras. We got more school psychologists and social workers, particularly at our middle school when we see social emotional stresses higher. But we need state and federal support. And here we need federal support now for those social emotional supports. Districts like Fairfax have the wealth to do it. Many districts are waiting in desperation, and that's part of the teacher turnover. They're getting out because they're crying for help. The universities haven't helped them. The school districts haven't helped them. They're looking for the federal government to help. So now's the time to act.
Good afternoon. I am so thrilled to be here today to really advance a vision of teacher preparation that takes into account the human development aspect of preparing educators. So many times I've heard the expression about teacher training, which reduces the process for becoming skilled, knowledgeable, and a practicing educator to a very bite-sized, discrete kind of thinking around what that entails. When we assume a human development framework and perspective, we're in a whole different lane. We're thinking about the people who are entering into the field of education, and primarily if we're looking at the traditional college-age student who've gone through the trauma actually of being in a system that has overemphasized the cognitive and the academic achievement aspect of learning. We're recognizing that many of these students coming into our teacher preparation program have not had any experience with their needs being attended to. And when we think about social emotional learning, we are thinking about human capacity development. We're thinking about the ability to have empathy, to build relationship with others, to actually create positive and maintain positive relationships, which we know is a highly employable set of skills in any profession, let alone one that is devoted to human beings, such as teaching youth and adolescents. So the traditional college-age student coming to our campus at Eastern Michigan University begins entering into our program freshman year, and we know that that is different than many programs across the country in which they are starting as a second admit during junior year and thinking about it as a professional sequence for 2 years. What we're doing is actually looking at these young people, for the most part, at a transitional phase in their lives. They are people seeking others in many regards, and they're looking for a community. We are providing that community, and in that community, we are addressing the kinds of experiences that will allow them to look at themselves as learners to begin with, to look at themselves as social emotional beings in a community of practice. And by practice, I'm actually referring to the idea that this learning and becoming an educator happens over time. They come into our program. We spend a considerable amount of time building this community with them in support of practicing educators and leaders. And as they exit as graduates of our program, we are in community with them in the schools in which they're serving. So we think about that as from a whole school university community partnership.
Good afternoon, everyone. With respect to the implementation of of social emotional learning district-wide, I should say, we really began the first 2 years. It's a 5-year process. When a school comes on, it's the 5-year process to implement SEL district school-wide. And our first 2 years are primarily focused on adult social emotional learning. So clearly we go over the competencies, but then how do teachers model that? Being aware of their triggers, being socially aware of the needs of our students that are being manifested in the classroom, and sometimes through misbehavior, and being able to navigate that. These are skill sets that that our teachers, when they come into the field, do not have. So our budget in our district is a locally funded effort. We do not receive support from the state. We're not recipients of a large grant. This is the commitment of our board and our superintendent, because this is the right thing to do for children. And so we're using precious dollars to, in a sense, supplement learning that should have taken place at institutions of higher education, because our teachers don't necessarily have that skill set. Some come with it, but some don't. For some, it's a way of life. For many, it's not. Particularly in secondary schools where the education process is more transactional as opposed to relational. You go from one class to the next. It's hard to build relationships with 200 students. And so that is a skill set that we are working to teach our teachers in El Paso ISD. When we share that learning with our teachers, they are just incredibly supportive and incredibly receptive. They see the need for it. In a recent survey of our staff perceptions on the SEL implementation, 94% are strongly supportive of the work that we are engaging in. Yet only 57% feel that they have the skill set to carry it out. So we still have our work cut out for us, though. We've been at this for about 2.5 years. And I want to just echo what Dr. Schonert-Reichl shared, and that is that how students feel impacts how they learn. And that's very true of the adults as well. You know, they're not immune from the same things that impact students. They also experience traumas and stressors and so on and so forth. And so much of our focus on adult learning is focused on self-care, on being able to manage behaviors, as has been shared before, because the best resource that we actually have in the classrooms are our teachers. The best way to teach this, apart from an evidence-based program, is to model the behaviors. And so we go through great lengths. We follow the CASEL theory of action. We follow that pretty methodically to build that skill set within our teachers. The other thing that I'd like to share with you is the impact. So we began in a cohort process, again, 92 campuses, and the first cohort that we had were a group of early adopters. So eager principals, we met with faculties and staff. They were very receptive to the work. I'm pleased to report that first cohort, prior to implementation, the first year of implementation, I should say, they had a decrease in referrals of 58%. And that's pretty significant, because the opportunity cost of sending those students to ISS or OSS is learning. And I believe that has allowed us to turn around our district and to become one of the 3 highest performing districts in the state last year. As of 2018, that was a very proud achievement for our district. And I don't think that it's any mistake that our district has shifted to a more relational approach to education as opposed to transactional. We're starting to see those results in EPISD. Thank you.
Back to me. So thanks, everybody. First of all, I just want to invite you all to question one another, if that would be of interest. I'm struck by, when I hear ruler, one of the things that is included in the ruler curriculum is a mood meter. And I'm wondering if everybody here were asked to fill out their mood meter. Do you wish you were watching the hearings across the way where our country is devolving into all kinds of, but it is actually interesting that we're here today, actually at this exact moment. And if you tracked this conversation against the other one, and you just tracked word graphs, forget what side of the political spectrum you're on. In my view, we're hearing a discussion about an emerging country that most people don't even know is happening. Because we think I mean, again, I'm not going to get political here, but we think what's happening over there is actually what's controlling the future of the country. But this conversation about helping children to understand and regulate their emotions, to connect, to make meaning, to make purpose, to have character, to have grit, to have resilience, to have hope, to achieve academically. This conversation is actually, if you ask me, and obviously I'm biased, the headline right now in the country. Is human development going to change us at a fundamental level? I think so. How do we catch up is my question for you guys. I mean, maybe we can start with El Paso, but you guys, El Paso and Fairfax are in different stages. In some ways, I feel like when we talk to educators on the front lines, they feel like once they see the big picture, it's just a race. As soon as you change one thing, you got to change the next thing. And as soon as you change that thing, you got to change another thing. And all of a sudden, it's just, we got to help kids, and we got to help teachers, then we got to help teachers, then we got to change discipline, then we got to change discipline, then we got to change training. And how do we catch up?
Honestly, I don't know that we do catch up because the work continually is evolving. For example, when we first dove into this work, we weren't aware. We were so new to it that we weren't necessarily aware of the issues of the implications of equity. And so our work has now evolved so that SEL is done in service of equity. And so to me, there's so much more to learn. There's so much more to do in the districts. And I think that's a powerful opportunity for us to continue to learn and grow as learning organizations and continue to advance the learning. I don't think that, truthfully, I don't think that the work should stop. I think we should continue to identify new ways to serve and support students as needs arise.
I would love to add that even using the phrasing to catch up is problematic, especially in this context, because what we want to do is recognize our humanity and what it means to have a humanizing educational experience. And that means for everyone in the system. So when I think about the approaches that work really well is when we stop thinking about ourselves as being members of discrete, separate organizations. And that's why we're using a broad understanding of school-university community partnerships as a way to think about, well, the reason we're preparing educators isn't for the university to increase enrollment. In fact, it's in service to our districts and our community organizations. When we take that to heart, we have changed the conversation. And that's also why we've developed a Michigan SEL alliance, because no longer should we be competing with other teacher preparation programs for the dwindling number of students coming into programs. If we combine our efforts, that's a game changer right there. We're trying to build a collective that makes sense for the interests of our healthy, thriving communities. That's what we're about.
Two ways that we can catch up. One, we in Fairfax with our school board and board of supervisors passed an equity policy. We have to have an equity lens because what teachers see is, oh, there's this, there's that, there's 50 more balls in the air. Put equity as a key value for your education system, and then you can insert in curriculum, you can insert in discipline, you can insert in social emotional supports. We just announced a new chief equity officer last year. I know DC Schools is here with the chief equity officer. Equity is part of how we can catch up because it changes the way you even have a conversation. That's number one. And number two, something, Tim, you said about what your organization has done is what we're about to do. Because the principals and teachers are saying, Scott, you were in the system for 25 years. We need a theory of action for us to articulate to our teachers, how do we work as a school system? So the theory of action that you've created for an organization, we've got to do a better job of that. And part of what it is we're saying teachers and all of the folks who work in our district will collaborate in groups to solve problems. That's going to be one of the core. It's called professional learning communities and education wording, but you're going to be a collaborator. If you want to be a solo lobo, a lone wolf, you need to go work somewhere else. So I think an equity lens and a commitment to collaboration, that's going to help us talk about the whole child at the classroom level, the school level, and at the school district level.
Right. So so thank you for those answers, Wendy. I just first of all, I grew up in a political family, so I have a naturally competitive thing I'm trying to get rid of. So thank you for. I did not have social and emotional learning as a child. But more seriously, what I meant, and I appreciate your corrective, what I meant when I said catch up is catch up to where we want to be. It's all, not catch up to one another or catch up in competition. At least this time I didn't mean it competitively. So I guess my last question, and then we'll shift a little bit for our last few minutes, and I again invite the conversation to join others to the Higher Ed Act and the reauthorization, because I want to ask you, my next question is going to be, how and what difference would it make if the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act had significant language that challenged all that federal resource to move in this direction? Before we get there, though, you're all on the front lines. You're educating in districts that are red and blue and purple. This is not, I said at the beginning, should not be a Republican or a Democrat or progressive or conservative or whatever issue. But when you say words like equity or cultural competence or empathy, most people hear one political party. And if you say words like character and purpose and grit, most people hear another political party. How do you beat that back? How do you avoid getting trapped in the language that seems to be signaling to people you're leaning left or you're leaning right, and stay in the center where you're leaning towards children?
Well, let me just say, by the way, I do think social emotional learning, our democracy requires advanced work around social emotional learning, or we're going to see it go backwards. So we need to do it at the school level. We need to do it in our political conversations too. It's not easy to do. Passing an equity policy, we have Republicans and Democrats in Fairfax County included on the Board of Supervisors and our school board. We had individual conversations out of the public glare about what they wanted to see in an equity policy. Equity can mean many, many things to many people. So defining what equity is, and part of it, again, simplistic, but every child by name and by need is what an equity policy means. You've got to give kids what they need. Some kids need more academic support. Some need more social, emotional support. And my view is the kids still not successful in school systems, whether they're private or public, charter or non-traditional. Their central challenges today are more social, emotional than they are academic. In fact, because the social emotional has gone unaddressed, they're not able to push themselves to higher academic levels. So I think it's small group conversations allowed us, both passed unanimously. There were no votes. So the community didn't see it as a Democratic or as a Republican. They saw it as something good for kids. And now it's actually starting to talk about equity. We just had our joint meeting of both boards yesterday about equity in the funding mechanisms in the state versus the locality and how distribution of dollars is done.
Yeah.
So it's moving from just equity on the child to equity about the structures and systems that support childs in schools.
Nice, right.
So I would just argue that there might be different language used around the articulation of outcomes, but I think anyone on the political spectrum could identify some outcomes that could be met through social emotional learning and our commitment to it. So I don't know enough about this political landscape here, but I can tell you with the communities that we serve, we're able to address the needs of all the constituents through attending to educator preparation in a fundamentally different way when we attend to their being and becoming. And that has a universal end game.
Good, beautiful.
And I can share our experience in El Paso. About 3 years ago, our superintendent and our board convened a series of community meetings. So over 50 meetings, over 2,000 stakeholders from that community, from all kinds of political, the different political affiliations that we have in that community. And really what we focused on is, we focused on a graduate profile. What did we want for our students when they walked away? And so we wanted them to be positioned to be able to thrive not only academically, but then post-graduation, to be able to thrive in any environment. And so that was where we settled on on, this path towards social emotional learning, allowing students to really truly fulfill their potential in pretty much in any arena. That gives them some great employability skills, gives them the ability to adapt to different environments, to be able to adapt to the transition into higher ed. And so really we focused on, again, what do we want for the children of our community? Access and opportunity and the ability to thrive beyond the graduation stage.
Great. So we just have a few minutes left for questions, either from you or, again, and I want to invite Dr. Duong and Kim to join this conversation, and any of the rest of you who, if you've got points you wish you'd had heard, because some of you are just as expert as, certainly as I am, if not the panelists, please raise your voices. We just have 6 minutes left, but the key message here is that the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act is coming up, and this is a big chance. It's a big chance for those of us who are advocates to have our voices heard. It's a big chance for people who are leading at the federal level to make a significant difference. It's a big chance to move into a growing consensus that is actually, quite broad and very powerful and make a real difference instead of just tinkering around the edges. How do we make that happen? I'd invite maybe an open conversation on that in these final few minutes. Any thoughts, comments, or questions from the audience? Yes. Yeah.
Hi, Brenda Elliott, Chief Equity Officer for DC Public Schools. And the question I'll ask is, how do you convince teachers and I would say your community stakeholders that SEL is not just for those kids, that I would say even our most affluent children really need to learn how to develop empathy, have a sense of different perspectives, and be able to value everyone that comes, what everyone brings to the community. And so I wonder what's the work that you're doing to ensure that people understand that SEL is for all children and not a specific group of young people. Thank you.
Yeah, it's, and I don't like the whole idea of commodifying education, but so even my language is problematic, but it's an easy sell. So from the absolute, we have the full gamut. And because we prepare so many educators, we actually are an exporter to other states. I can tell you we have the full gamut of community stakeholders that we prepare educators for. There isn't a district out there that I'm aware of that wouldn't be champions of addressing students' social and emotional learning and development. And it's not, so your question though is how do we help others to possibly see the value of this work in changing perhaps the dynamics among those within a school community, perhaps? Is that part of your question in terms of equity and?
How do we support young people that have mental health needs, or are our most vulnerable young people or students who are misbehaving? But really, it is about all young people need these non-cognitive skills to not only be successful in school and life, but to help to create the society that we want, where all people are valued, and there's empathy for all people and the value for different perspectives. So just that piece of how you make sure people understand this is about everyone growing.
Well, you're in DC, I'm in Fairfax, so I'm going to say it this way. We had a period of time in Fairfax, during the 5 years actually I had left, we had one high school, 6 suicides. Those suicides mostly came from upper middle class, white families. That's how you sell SEL. In fact, the board really, I'll be honest, took the deeper dive, and the community going, oh my God, the kids we feel who have been successful, but through the lens of academics have been failing through social emotional. So this is not limited to one community or one zip code to solve. SEL is about our entire community and our spectrum of kids in ways that we don't know are experiencing trauma. And you can experience trauma whether you're a poor kid or a rich kid. It's just the form of what that trauma is. But I do feel something Tim said earlier, the tug of war to label it, is it this kid or that kid? This is something about every kid. And it's the mix of academic and social emotional supports. It's what great schooling has to be. Every great school needs to have a climate where academic and social emotional needs have been met. And the reality is where we have the work to do is with the social, emotional support and fill-in at every level, private school, public school. Day to day, look at what the media saturates us with. Our kids, particularly in this digital age, don't have the social, emotional judgments, the supports in place to make good decisions. And the stakes are even higher than before, frankly.
And I'm not telling you anything you probably don't know, but the rise in anxiety and depression among 19 to 22-year-olds has been a dramatic factor on all of the campuses across the country. And so we are recognizing this as an area where if we attend to the social emotional learning at a much broader base, we have a chance to help support these young people in transition.
Last question, burning question, statement that something needs to be said that we haven't quite nailed it yet. Here we go.
Hi, I'm Amanda Peskin. I'm interning at the Department of Education. How would you balance social emotional learning in schools with like the pressure to teach for the test?
Can I take that one on? So here's the good news. The good news is that when you do effective evidence-based social emotional learning, test scores go up. So this is one of those either ors. Do we teach to the test or do we teach to the heart? The answer is you teach to both. Nobody in this room, I don't think, and certainly nobody I know in this field doesn't want kids to learn how to read. And we don't think reading is optional. We don't think learning the dates of the Civil War are optional. People need to be conversant in the information necessary to function in the world. There's nobody in this movement who doesn't think basics are important, I believe. What we've argued is that we can't get to that unless we've got the attention of the child. Literally, neuroscientifically, we can't teach the child how to read if the child isn't emotionally and socially open to the learning. So it's about breaking the split when you put the kids back together as a curricular and a pedagogical issue, you get the test scores. So we're in fact, all of our meta-analyses show improvements in test scores that are almost as good as the improvements in behavior. The either or test scores versus is kind of a paradigm we gotta break. That would be my quick answer. For those of you who are being inspired or at least excited by this extraordinary group of experts, Ellen Fern is in the back helping us lead our coalition to try to work on the reauthorization issues and to continue this conversation so that in the near term we can make a real difference. I thank you all for coming, thank our panelists, and thank the Committee for Children and CASEL for convening us and look forward to future conversations. Thank you.